As we begin our journey through Mark's Gospel, we thought it would be useful just to give a little bit of background information and a bit of an introduction to it as the Gospel of Jesus Christ. We've got 4 authorized biographies of Jesus in the Bible. We call them the Gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it's interesting to know that there were lots of other Gospels floating around at the time that these were written and have been discovered archaeologically. And they've been used by and popularized by people like Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code. And these other Gospels, they depict stories of Jesus which are either ridiculously fanciful or which actually don't reflect the teaching and character of Jesus as seen in what is termed the canonical or authorized Gospels.
Yeah, these other Gospels were rejected very early on by the church as being written a very long time after the Jesus events, or if they didn't have an established link with one of the apostles, because that was one of the main criteria used by the church to decide which books should be included in the New Testament and which shouldn't.
So the authorized Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each had a different focus in choosing which parts of the Jesus story to include within them. And Matthew has a typically Jewish focus, and it includes many references to the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy.
Luke was keen to show that Jesus was saviour for the whole world, Jews and Gentiles too. And he often draws out Jesus' concern and care for the outsider in society.
And John's Gospel focuses on the theological reflection on who Jesus was and is, and it's more poetic, symbolic, and differently structured to the other Gospels.
Which draws us to Mark's Gospel. It's generally accepted as the first Gospel to be written. That's around the years 65 to 70 AD. That's a mere 30 years from the events which they describe. Well, that might seem a long time, but in ancient literary terms, it isn't very long at all. And it's pretty well accepted that Mark's Gospel was used as a source for Matthew and Luke's Gospels. All of Mark appears in Matthew, apart from just 40 verses, and a half of Mark is also in Luke.
So why was Mark's Gospel written down? Well, simply and essentially because the eyewitnesses were starting to die out. It was important to record the teaching and life of Jesus through the apostles. And that's what we were referring to in Acts 2:42. And that illustrates the importance of the apostles' teaching to the early church. The church was growing larger, and the story of Jesus needed to be shared beyond a single person recounting their story. And people around the world both wanted and needed to know the story of Jesus. And there was a real growth, as we've mentioned, in false or inaccurate views or stories about Jesus. And this is seen in a lot of Paul's letters addressing false teaching in the church, and also the increase in other gospels which did not reflect the accounts that we've got preserved in what we call the canonical or authorized gospels.
So who was Mark? Mark, or John Mark, is mentioned numerous times in the New Testament. It's his house that Peter escaped to from prison in Acts chapter 12. He's brought to Antioch by Paul and Barnabas. In fact, Barnabas was Mark's relative. That's also in Acts 12. He accompanied them on their travels. He left them at Perga, which Paul saw as a desertion, which led to the separation of Paul and Barnabas, which we read about in Acts 15.
Mark also appears in the letters in Colossians. He's back to being a companion of Paul's. By 2 Timothy, he's accompanying Timothy in Asia Minor, and he's even mentioned in Peter's letter, 1 Peter 5:13, and quite possibly that locates him in Rome with Peter, and that lends support to the tradition of Mark's Gospel having a kind of a place of writing in Rome itself.
It's even been suggested that the young man who fled naked from Gethsemane may well have been a young John Mark. You can read that in Mark 14. It would be typical for an author to mention his presence, but not his name. And we see that in John's Gospel as well.
Beyond the Gospels, we also have some strong church history, which relates about Mark. And it says it's by Papias, who was Bishop of Hierapolis, and he's quoted by another church historian called Eusebius. And it says, Mark, who became Peter's interpreter, wrote accurately, but not in order, as many of the things said and done by the Lord that he had noted. He followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but not as a complete work of the Lord's saying. So Mark made no mistake in writing some things just as he had noted them, for he was careful of one thing, to leave nothing he had heard out and to say nothing falsely. So we have here in Mark's gospel an early text about the life of Jesus, written down in a pretty short time after the events from reliable eyewitness sources, Peter at the very heart of the story. So we think this is a pretty good basis to start from.
Mark gets straight to the point. He explains in the first words of his book exactly what he thinks of Jesus and what the purpose of the book is. This is what we have in the very first verse of Mark's gospel, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. This is Mark's overture. He sets the theme for the rest of the book and the story, and it tells you the end before you've hardly started. This story is about the start of the earth-shatteringly significant news of the arrival of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God.
So the gospel explodes into life with that first phrase, and it doesn't stop from that breakneck speed throughout. Mark's gospel was once described to me as the Arnold Schwarzenegger of the gospels because it's so action-packed. It races through scene after scene of action, and we have words like immediately and straight away and after that Jesus went to, and all these links very often happen in Mark's gospel to keep the pace going. So in Mark, we have Jesus. He's baptized and given his father's seal. It says, "You are my son." He's tempted in the wilderness, calls his first disciples, casts out a demon, heals many, including a leper and a paralyzed man.
He grants forgiveness for his sins, which really offends the Pharisees. He calls Levi. He addresses the issue of fasting and Sabbath and establishes a new take on the law. Crowds follow him and evil spirits are cast out. He sets apart 12 apostles, and he's misunderstood by people.
He shares a few parables, often about seeds growing. He calms a storm. He casts out a legion of demons. He heals a woman with a bleeding problem and raises a dead girl. He's rejected in his hometown, sends out his disciples, and his cousin John is executed.
He feeds 5,000 people miraculously, walks on water, clashes with the Pharisees again, heals a Gentile woman's daughter and a deaf-mute man, feeds 4,000 people miraculously, and heals a blind man.
And that's just the first half of the story. And that's significant because Mark's gospel is not just a random selection of different events rattled off by Peter and noted down by Mark. These are selected to back up the statement in that very first verse that this is the good news of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God.
What might be useful to orientate yourself in Mark's gospel is that it can be seen in two acts. And the first act is made up of all those events that we've just listed. Act 1 of Mark's gospel was about revealing who Jesus is to those around him and to us, the readers. It's about revealing the person of the King.
And Acts 2, which is chapters 9 to 16, the focus turns from who Jesus is to the road that he travels. And the road that he travels is the path to the cross. But it's in that chapter 8, that midway point, that we have that hinge. And it's a hinge point and the transition between Act 1 and Act 2. It's not an interval, although we will be having an interval called Christmas. And the end of Act 1, the person of the King lands at a question. In fact, it lands at the question.
Yes, it's perhaps the most pointed question which Jesus asked of anyone in the Gospels. And it's the question which he asks, which has resonated through history as the ultimate decision laid before any person. He asks Peter, "Who do you say I am?" It's the same question that we will be exploring together over the weeks ahead. So we really hope that you will come and join us.